As I mentioned, my speech is going to be about the Basel Convention. I'll explain a bit about conventions in the UN system in general and then go into more specific details. So yes, the title of the speech is Toxic Waste for Beginners. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I'm sure you are aware, one of the main tasks of the United Nations, the UN, is to carry out what we like to refer to as global governance. And part of this involves agreeing on global cooperative solutions to issues that affect all nations. Once an agreement is reached on a specific topic, typically a convention or a treaty is drawn up, and its date of entry into force is decided. So countries agree what they want to do about an issue, and then some of them, or all of them, usually some, sign the convention first. So they first sign it, and then later on they ratify it. Signing it indicates their intention to comply with its provisions. Then ratifying it means that they agree to be legally bound by the terms of the convention. So this means that they also have to sort of transpose it into their own national legal systems. They need to enact the necessary legislation to give domestic effect to that convention. So this means essentially it's all very well to sign a UN convention saying that you agree that the minimum age for someone to go and work down a mine should be 18. It's fine to say that you intend to agree that that should be the case. But if your laws currently say that someone can work down a mine from the age of 14, then you haven't reached the point where you're ratifying the convention. So you may have the minimum age of 14, and then you sign the convention to say, yes, we agree it should be raised to 18. Then you discuss with your own parliament, for example, and enact the necessary legislation in your country to give effect to that convention, so to make sure your country complies with it. And at that point, you ratify the convention, and it's now legally binding. So usually there are certain countries that group together to promote a certain convention because they all agree on what should be done about a topic. Other countries perhaps don't agree yet, or they don't feel ready yet to enact the necessary laws in their country for that to really work for them. So they might join a convention later on, and that process is called accession. So the convention already exists, countries have signed it, they ratified it, it's entered into force on a specific date. Later on, countries come along and they accede to the convention, so they sort of join the club of countries who also want to play by the same rules, essentially. So, to talk about a specific a specific example of a convention that has been adopted as part of the UN system, I'm going to tell you about the Basel Convention. That's its short name. If you want the longer name, it's, and I will give you the versions in French and Spanish. So it's the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal. La Convention de Bâle sur le contrôle des mouvements transfrontières de déchets dangereux et de leur eliminación. El Convenio de Basilea sobre el control de los movimientos transfronterizos de los desechos peligrosos y su eliminación. We can call it the Basel Convention for simplicity's sake. The overarching objective of the Basel Convention is to protect human health and the environment against the adverse effects of hazardous wastes. The convention was adopted on the 22nd of March 1989 by the Conference of Plenipotentiaries in Basel, Switzerland. Why was it adopted? Well, it was essentially in response to a public outcry that came up in the 1980s following the discovery that in Africa and other parts of the developing world, there were huge deposits of toxic wastes imported from abroad. So certain countries are saying, we've got all this toxic waste, let's send it over to Africa, no problem. So the convention, the Basel Convention, was adopted to try and combat this problem. One question is, why would anyone import or export toxic waste in the first place? Well, why would someone export it? You can understand that completely. People would rather not have to deal with their own waste. If you can send it off to the other side of the world, then all the better. It's kind of what's known as Nimby Syndrome. Nimby stands for not in my backyard. I don't want to have to deal with this. You can deal with it. I don't mind who deals with it, just not me. That's the concept. So you don't want it in your own backyard. Whose backyard you send it to? Well, you send it to the enormous backyard of the developing world. So anyway, that's one side of the reasoning of why people might export toxic waste. But why would any country accept an import of waste, especially if it's toxic waste? Well, in some sense, it's because one person's trash is another person's treasure. When it comes to something like household appliances, an old fridge does contain toxic elements. But an old fridge that doesn't see much use to someone in the developed world might be considered worth fixing in another part of the world. Or it might be worth extracting the different elements and parts of the fridge to then use for other purposes. So if you can be bothered, then you can take useful materials from other people's waste. But some other types of waste are less useful, so it's not quite so obvious why anyone would want to bother accepting any imports of that type of waste. But there are economic reasons for this. Some waste products contain commodities, essentially raw materials. It might be a very arduous task to sort through a pile of rubbish and find what's useful within it. But at the end of the day, if you have got the time and resources to do that, then you can extract useful raw materials. And if there's a shortage of those in your country, that could be worth the effort. For example, back in the 1980s, China started to import solid waste to use as raw materials to try and make up for their domestic shortage of different resources. So it might be types of metal, for example, certain chemicals. So for them at the time, it was worthwhile importing waste. Nowadays, however, the tide is changing. China used to be one of the biggest importers of scrap waste, particularly from the United States. But they imposed an import ban on this type of waste in 2017. Why did they do that? Well, certain types of solid waste are highly polluting and they severely damage the environment and public health. Nowadays, in China, there's enhanced public awareness about these issues, particularly environmental and health issues. And the Chinese government is aiming to progress towards sustainable development. So they've decided it's not worth it importing all this waste. So that means the waste exporting countries in Europe and North America, for example, need to look for alternative destinations. So they turned to Thailand and Vietnam, for example. But eventually Thailand and Vietnam have also decided that they're not so sure if they want to import all this waste either. It was just getting too much effort to sort through it all, and actually sometimes what was sold as perfectly recyclable waste contained some hazardous toxic elements buried in the mass of all the different types of waste. So they decided to change their approach. For example, in July 2018, Thailand decided to ban waste imports. Many of the ships, however, carrying the shipments of waste were already on the way, so many of them were left floating in the sea with nowhere to dock because the countries closed the ports to this type of cargo. And in Vietnam as well, they also stopped shipments in 2018 of this type of waste, particularly because there's been reported findings of prohibited items of hazardous electronic waste, also known as e-waste, mixed in with all the recyclable waste. E-waste, electronic waste, has become the world's fastest growing rubbish stream. You must recognise the concept. We've all discarded a phone or a computer and replaced it with a newer, sleeker model. So it's obvious why that would happen, why all this electronic waste would come up. But the growth is staggering. In fact, the worldwide accumulation of e-waste has more than doubled in the past 9 years. According to the United Nations University, which is a global think tank that tracks this problem, in 2016, the yearly accumulation reached 49.3 million tonnes. Imagine the quantity. According to what I read, that would be enough to fill more than 1 million lorries, those big long lorries with 18 wheels, more than a million lorries that could, if you line them all up, they would stretch all the way from New York to Bangkok and back. So as you can see, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. So what can we do with electronic waste? This is halfway point in the speech, probably a bit over actually, if you want to swap. Now what do we do with e-waste? Well, brings us back to the Basel Convention. When countries ratify a convention, they become parties to the convention. And to the Basel Convention, there are currently 186 parties to the convention. Can you guess which developed country has not ratified the convention? As the previous speaker mentioned, yes, of course, it's the United States. It's the only developed country that hasn't ratified the Basel Convention on hazardous waste. They don't even have a national law for managing e-waste. And the individual states within the United States are left to manage the issue independently and on their own. And as it happens, 15 of the states in the US don't have any legislation on e-waste that's currently in effect. The European Union, by contrast, has some of the toughest enforcement of e-waste laws in the world. They ban exports to developing countries and they compel manufacturers to help fund recycling. So Europe's recycling rates for electronic equipment are around 35% overall, and that's much higher than the rate in the US. So it's kind of embarrassing that the US hasn't acceded to the convention, the Basel Convention. It's, according to European officials, the US has always sort of been the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. Anyway, if e-waste is dealt with properly, there are actually some valuable gains to be made. E-waste can be described as hazardous because it contains some toxic materials such as mercury, lead, and other materials such as brominated flame retardants. And as the Basel Convention mentions, those hazardous metals, as well as some rare materials of strategic value, such as indium and palladium, can be recovered, recycled, and reused. They can be a valuable source of what's called secondary raw material. Laptops and mobile phones also contain valuable elements such as gold and silver and copper. So there are valuable gains to be made, as I said. However, barely 20% of the world's e-waste is collected and delivered to formal recycling plants. And people don't really know what happens to the rest. It's not managed properly. There are only 41 countries in the world that compile statistics on e-waste. And they only collect part of the data, and this sort of partial data collection can't really keep up with the expansion of electronic devices in so many different consumer categories. You know, as you can see in our daily lives, there are so many devices being invented by the day, and then being discarded once people have found the next best thing. Therefore, to deal with this rapid evolution of the situation, the Basel Convention needs to evolve with our evolving world. Since 2002, so I mentioned the convention was adopted in 1989, so as time passes, we've got to 2002, and work has been done since then to deal with e-waste. Some technical guidelines on e-waste have been developed over the past few years. There's also something called the Expert Working Group on the e-waste technical guidelines. They had their first face-to-face meeting in Beijing, in China, in January 2018, so about a year ago. Progress is being made. Needless to say, the arrogant assumption that we can keep producing colossal amounts of waste needs to give way to newer, more sustainable solutions. We can't just keep producing e-waste, plastic and other types of waste and dump it on developing countries, because they're having none of it. They're realising what a bad idea it is as well, catching up essentially. So we need sustainable solutions. The problem of e-waste is being exacerbated by sort of pincer movement. You've got the waste quantities relentlessly increasing on one side, both in developed and developing countries. And then you've got developing countries who used to be the recipients of that waste, now changing their stance and refusing to accept imports of waste from developed countries. So there's all this rubbish is being squeezed into a tight spot in the middle, floating around on ships in the sea with nowhere to go. So all of those shipments of e-waste and toxic waste floating around with no port to dock in, they're not just going to vanish into thin air. So to begin solving the problem, we simply need to stop producing so much rubbish. Otherwise, we're going to drown ourselves in it. Thank you very much.